On a stretch of dry farmland at the edge of town lived a man most people had forgotten about. To the neighbors, he was just John, a quiet farmer, a relic of an older world, clinging to soil that no one else wanted. But behind the cracked barns and silent fields was a history richer than anyone imagined. And when greed came knocking, when the people he trusted the least tried to take what little he had left, John didn't fight with fists or with anger. He fought with something sharper, something slower. And when the dust finally settled, it wasn't the land that was gone. It was them. John Whitmore was a farmer the way some men are soldiers, not by choice, but by blood. His grandfather had tilled that soil. His father had weathered storms on it, and John had buried both of them beneath it. The land wasn't just property. It was memory. It was identity. It was home. But in the new world of developments and profits, men like John were considered obstacles. And for the homeowners association that governed the growing town around him, his land wasn't heritage. It was opportunity. The first letters came politely enough. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, your property is being considered for community improvement." But everyone knew what those words really meant. They wanted him gone. John ignored them. He patched fences, tended his crops, lived the simple life. But the HOA president, a man named Richard Cole, wasn't used to being ignored. Richard was slick. Perfect hair, sharp suits, a smile that never touched his eyes. He saw John's farmland not as soil but as dollars. And when John refused the first offer, Richard laughed. "You'll come around," he said. Then came the fines, a notice pinned to his gate. "Your fence is not regulation height." Another the next week. "Your crops violate landscaping guidelines." It was absurd, laughable. But to John, it was war. They thought he would bend. They thought he would break. But John wasn't the type to break. He was the type to wait. At the next community meeting, Richard stood tall at the front, papers in hand. "Mr. Whitmore refuses to comply with HOA standards," he declared. Neighbors chuckled. Some whispered, "He should just sell already." John sat at the back, silent, weathered hands resting on his knees, eyes steady. When Richard called on him, expecting a stammer, John rose slowly, and with a voice roughened by years in the sun, he said only this: "This land has been in my family for 100 years, and I'll be damned if it leaves with you." The room went still. Then laughter erupted. Richard smirked. "We'll see about that." What no one realized was that John already had his own folder, thicker, heavier, and when the time was right, he would open it, and the whole room would choke on silence. After that meeting, Richard doubled down. The fines weren't just occasional anymore. They came daily, one for the mailbox being too rustic, one for grass that was not evenly trimmed, another for a tractor parked too long on his own driveway. It was a slow suffocation, not designed to break his body, but to break his spirit. Neighbors started to avoid him. No one wanted to be seen talking to the man marked as an enemy of the HOA. His mailbox, once full of letters from friends, now carried nothing but threats. And yet, John said nothing, because silence, he knew, could be louder than rage. They thought they were pushing him into a corner. But really, they were pushing him into focus. Late at night, when the neighborhood was dark, John lit a single lamp at his kitchen table. There, he began his study. The HOA bylaws, a thick booklet most people tossed in a drawer, became his weapon. Every line, every footnote, every contradiction. He read about meetings that required notice, but weren't announced, about funds collected for repairs that never happened, about board members who had quietly approved exceptions for themselves. Page after page, the hypocrisy grew. And with every discovery, John's anger didn't flare. It sharpened. He wasn't just fighting for land anymore. He was fighting for dignity. At first, John thought he was alone. But then whispers started reaching him. A young couple, fined for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue. An elderly veteran, told to remove his American flag. A single mother, charged hundreds because her kids left bikes in the driveway. They all had their stories. They all had their bruises from the same hand. And slowly, one by one, they came to John. "You're not the only one," they told him. "We're tired too." The man the HOA had tried to isolate was becoming something else, a center of gravity, the quiet leader of a storm building in silence. Richard and his board didn't see it. Why would they? They believed they were untouchable. At the next meeting, Richard stood taller than ever. "Mr. Whitmore," he sneered, "has failed to comply with 32 separate violations. He is hereby ordered to vacate within 60 days. The crowd murmured. John didn't move. He just sat there, hands folded, listening. Richard mistook that silence for defeat. "Gentlemen," he said to the board, "this is what happens when you refuse to follow the rules." The laughter came again, cold, cruel. But beneath the table, John's hand rested on a folder, thicker than the one Richard held. He didn't open it yet. Not yet, because timing was everything. They thought they had 60 days to erase him. But in 60 days, it wouldn't be John who disappeared. It would be them. John wasn't just collecting evidence. He was preparing a strike. He reached out to a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but the son of an old friend, young, sharp, hungry. Together they built a case brick by brick. Financial mismanagement, unlawful fines, personal gain from community funds. By the time they were finished, John had something Richard never imagined. Power. The power of truth, the power of patience, and the power of a man who had nothing left to lose. Word spread quietly like roots beneath the soil. The HOA thought the neighborhood was united against John. But behind closed doors, whispers turned into conversations. One by one, families began to admit what they'd suffered. The Hendersons, fined for hanging Christmas lights that were too bright. The Garcias, threatened for planting a small vegetable patch. The Parkers, told their child's wheelchair ramp was unsightly. Every story was another crack in the HOA's mask. And John was there, listening, recording, collecting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rally crowds. He simply offered his table, his coffee, his ear. And the people who once avoided him now found themselves sitting with him at midnight, signing affidavits, swearing statements. The land they stole from him was becoming the ground on which they would fall. The HOA thought they were fighting one stubborn old man. They didn't realize. They had woken an entire neighborhood. Richard still strutted like a king, but his board was beginning to sweat. 2 members started skipping meetings. One slipped John an anonymous note. "You're right. He's been lying to us, too." Even Richard's closest ally, a man named Harris, was caught building an unapproved deck behind his house. The very kind of violation they fined others for. John didn't confront them. Not yet. He let their own arrogance do the work. Every time they bent their rules, he marked it down. Every time they whispered behind Richard's back, he took note. The house of cards was trembling, and John was the wind. But Richard wasn't blind. He noticed the change, the way neighbors stopped nodding when he spoke, the way they lingered a little too long at John's porch. So Richard pushed harder. One morning, John woke to find a giant red notice nailed to his gate. Final warning, eviction in 30 days. Contractors circled the property like vultures. Richard even showed up himself, smirking at John from the sidewalk. "Tick-tock," he said. "Your time's almost up." John didn't reply. He just watched. Because inside his house, every piece of Richard's corruption sat neatly in a binder, waiting. They thought they were counting down his days, but really, he was counting down theirs. John's lawyer, Michael, was young but sharp, the kind of man who saw holes in every wall. "We've got them," he told John, flipping through the evidence. "Fraud, misuse of funds, unlawful practices. It's airtight. But timing is everything. We can't just hit them now. We need to wait until they're at their strongest. Then the fall will be harder." John nodded. Patience had always been his weapon. "So when?" he asked. Michael smiled. "At the annual community meeting, the one where the whole neighborhood comes. That's when you drop this. That's when the empire falls." John looked out his window at the fading sun. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a smile. He could almost hear the land breathing with him, waiting for justice. As the days ticked by, the neighborhood began to shift openly. Families who once stayed silent now greeted John warmly. Mothers brought him pies. Children ran through his yard. The man they had once treated as a pariah was now their shield. And Richard noticed. At first, he laughed it off. "They'll come crawling back," he said. But late at night, in the quiet of his pristine home, even he felt the unease. Because for the first time, the power wasn't all in his hands. And deep down, the night before the annual meeting, John couldn't sleep. He sat at his table, staring at the folder. Every paper inside was a bullet. Every page a truth too heavy to bury. Outside, the wind howled through the fields. The barns creaked. The soil lay still. It was as if the land itself was waiting, holding its breath. John poured himself a coffee, his hands steady. Tomorrow, he would no longer be the quiet man in the corner. Tomorrow, he would be the reckoning. The annual meeting was the crown jewel of the HOA calendar. The night where rules were read, budgets announced, and Richard Cole basked in the glow of his power. The hall was packed tighter than usual. Families who had once stayed home came in droves. Neighbors whispered in the aisles, exchanging nervous glances. Richard stood at the front in a crisp suit, beaming like a politician. At his side sat the board, stiff, silent, their smiles brittle. And near the back, in his usual chair, sat John, folder in his lap, eyes steady, waiting. Richard tapped the microphone, voice smooth as silk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here to maintain the beauty and integrity of our community. Some of you have challenged our standards, but rules are rules." He glanced toward John, lips curling in a sneer. "And as of tonight, we enforce them without exception. Mr. Whitmore has 30 days left before his property is reclaimed for the good of us all." Polite applause trickled through the hall, but it was thinner than Richard expected. Weaker, and in the silence that followed, John rose. John didn't speak quickly. He never did. He walked slowly to the front, folder in hand, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "You talk about rules," he said, voice low but steady. "But what about the rules you broke?" He opened the folder. Paper after paper, lined and marked, evidence gathered like a soldier's arsenal. "Here," he said, holding one up. "Funds collected for road repairs. Never used." Murmurs spread. "Here," another paper. "Board members approving unpermitted additions to their own homes." Gasps now. Whispers rising. Richard shifted in his seat. John's voice grew sharper. "You fined me for my land, for my fence, for my crops. But here's your treasurer pocketing community money for his vacations. Here's your vice president installing a pool without approval. Here's you, Richard, signing off on every violation you profited from." He slammed the papers down on the table. The sound echoed like a gavel. The room erupted. They thought John was powerless. But in that moment, he wasn't just a farmer. He was the judge, the jury, and the reckoning. Neighbors who once laughed at John now stood, shouting at Richard. "Is this true? Where's the money, Richard?" The board squirmed, sweat dripping, eyes darting anywhere but the crowd. Richard tried to laugh it off. "This is nonsense, hearsay." But John cut him short, sliding one last document across the table. A signed receipt, Richard's own signature, clear as day. The room fell silent. And in that silence, Richard's empire collapsed. "You wanted my land," John said quietly. "But it was you who had something to lose." Within days, Richard resigned. 2 board members followed. An investigation opened into the HOA's finances, and the empire that had ruled through fear was reduced to rubble. The fines were overturned, the eviction cancelled. And John? Not only did he keep his land, but he became the face of change. At the next vote, the neighborhood chose a new board, honest, humble, accountable. And when they asked John to serve as president, he shook his head. "No," he said. "I just want my soil, my peace." But the legacy of what he did, of how he stood when they tried to crush him, would never be forgotten. They stole his land, or thought they did, but in the end, it wasn't the land that mattered. It was justice. And the quiet man they tried to erase became the man they could never outrun. Because some men don't fight with fists. They fight with patience, and patience is the sharpest revenge of all. The days after the meeting felt strangely quiet. The streets that once carried tension now carried whispers of relief. Neighbors walked by John's house not with avoidance, but with nods of respect. Children who used to hurry past stopped to wave. And for the first time in years, John's mailbox filled with letters again. Not fines, not threats, but thank yous. The land was his again. The barns still creaked. The soil was still dry, but now it breathed freely, untouched by greedy hands. It was as if the earth itself had been waiting for justice, too. The HOA was restructured, stripped of its arrogance. New members stepped in. Neighbors who wanted fairness, not power. And though John refused to lead, his presence was everywhere. Every new rule, every fair vote, carried the shadow of his quiet resistance. The neighborhood changed. Lawns grew more colorful. Flags flew where people once feared to hang them. Gardens blossomed. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about freedom. And John had lit the spark. One evening, John sat on his porch, coffee in hand. The sun sank low, painting the sky in gold. He thought of his father, who had worked this soil, of his grandfather, who had defended it in harder times, and of the weight he carried, not just for himself, but for them. They had tried to take his land, but they didn't understand what land meant. It wasn't dirt. It was memory. It was blood. It was home. John closed his eyes, a faint smile on his weathered face. He hadn't just saved soil. He had saved dignity. They thought they could bury him under fines, rules, and fear. But instead, they planted something else, and what grew was stronger than they ever imagined. Years later, people still told the story. New families moved in and heard whispers about the man who stood against the board. Children who had once seen him as a grumpy old farmer grew up remembering him as the neighborhood's guardian. And every spring, when the fields bloomed just a little brighter than before, neighbors swore it was as if the land itself was smiling. John's fight became more than a victory. It became a legend, a reminder that silence is not weakness, and patience is not surrender. Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's survival. They stole his land, or so they thought. But in the end, they only gave him a story, one that would outlive fines, titles, and even men like Richard. Because when power is abused, when greed blinds, it takes only one person to stand firm, and everything crumbles. John wasn't a hero in shining armor. He wasn't loud. He wasn't cruel. He was patient. He was steady. And when the time came, he made them pay, not with anger, not with fists, but with truth. What would you have done in John's place? Fought sooner or waited for the perfect strike? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true life-inspired stories where patience, justice, and revenge take center stage.